I'm very tempted this morning to step aside for the next 20 minutes and give up this time to reflect on our first reading to the people who participated on Thursday morning in our Thursday morning Bible study, because they did an amazing job of coming to grips with Psalm 4 and of discovering in it, I think, some really profound and deep and spiritual and important words and lessons. But since I haven't warned them that they're preaching this morning, perhaps it's only fair that I try to take the next 20 minutes and try to at least approximate some of the glittering wisdom that we gleaned last Thursday in our study together of this psalm. It's really important in thinking about the Psalms that we take two things into consideration, at least two things. And the first one is to recognize that the Psalms are poetry. Actually, I suppose, strictly speaking, I suppose they're actually songs, but they are songs written poetically in order to be, they're poems written to be set to music. And poetry is not systematic theology. You don't go to poetry trying to clarify your dogma, trying to get all your theological ducks in a row. You go to poetry looking for the poet to evoke in you a feeling, a sensation, to open your heart to some insight that is communicated to us, perhaps not so much through our thinking intellect as through a more organic, intuitive kind of sense that is evoked in us by the beauty of the language, by the challenge of the imagery, by the cadence of the speech, and if set to music, also by the music. So Psalms are not works of dogma. They are not theological texts. They are poems. And the second thing that's important to keep in mind about the Psalms, and I know this is disappointing to some people, but it is almost certain that none, or at best very, very few of the Psalms were written by David. There are superscriptions that suggest they are, but those were added later. They are not part of the original. Hebrew linguists, who are way, way, way smarter than I am about these things, have studied the Hebrew in which the Psalms were written, and it is not the Hebrew that David would have spoken and known. To suggest that David is the author of the Psalms in the Bible is a bit like suggesting that Christopher Page is the author of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I struggled for a year in university to figure out the English of the Canterbury Tales, and I never was very successful. I certainly couldn't write it, much less speak it. So the Psalms come from a time after David was long gone. So the exercise of poring through the historical parts of Scripture and trying to find a setting for the Psalms in David's life, in the hopes that that will give us some insight into why he wrote what he wrote, is in fact a waste of time. There is no context for these anonymous poems. They cannot be accurately situated in history. So we really, the important thing about that is it means that we need to look at the Psalms just as they come to us. And we need to try to look into the text itself for understanding and inspiration. And actually, the Psalms themselves give us some indication as to what may have motivated the writer, whoever the writer was, to have written the words that he wrote. And Psalm 4 is a good example. Verse 1 says, the psalmist is praying to God and says, "Answer me when I call, O God of my right. You gave me room when I was in distress." And a little later, in verse 4, he says, "When you are disturbed, do not sin." So for whatever reason, the poet is in distress, and there is something going on that is disturbing. Now, I think that makes this a worthwhile psalm for us to examine. We are in distressing times. We have reason in our world today, every day, but perhaps particularly at this time, we have reason to be disturbed. COVID has been a source of enormous distress and disturbance in our world, in our culture, in our own little community. And it may be that for some of us, it feels now as though things are getting a little more under control, thanks to Evelyn's noble efforts to get us all vaccinated. But it's not over. And in many parts of the world, it is still deeply distressing and profoundly disturbing. And you have to wonder what it is in our lives that causes distress and disturbance. And I think COVID gives a very profound and important answer to that question. Most of what we find distressing, and most of the times we experience ourselves being disturbed, it's probably because we are facing a circumstance or a situation or a person or a reality that we feel is outside of our control. Situations that we can't control are deeply distressing and profoundly disturbing. And COVID has made us aware, I think, in a deep way of just how limited our control actually is. If we are attempting to avoid distress and disturbance by somehow believing in the illusion of our ability to be in control of the circumstances of life, we've taken a foolish avenue. COVID has taught us, I hope, if nothing else, that there are always circumstances in our lives that we cannot control. And in the face of that, the psalmist does the first thing that he can think to do. And it's the wisest thing that he can think to do. Answer me when I call, O God of my right. The psalmist cries out to God. In the face of a situation, whatever it was, that is distressing and disturbing, in the face of a situation that the psalmist knows he can't control, what he does is he defers to the possibility of a power higher and greater than his capacity to orchestrate the circumstances of his life. Recognizing his powerlessness, the psalmist looks for a power greater than his own. And he believes that he finds that power in his relationship to God. So he doesn't back away from his distress. He doesn't shy away from the disturbance that is a real part of his life. He doesn't deny that the situation is difficult. He doesn't pretend that he's not facing a hard circumstance. What he does do is he reaffirms to himself that there is something more going on here than perhaps he can immediately apprehend. That there is a force, a power at work in life that has his well-being at its heart. And so he suggests to himself, I think, because I believe that people on Thursday morning are getting tired of me harping on this, but I believe the Psalms are best looked at as internal dialogues taking place within the heart of the psalmist. And so in verse 4, the psalmist speaks to himself saying, when you are disturbed, do not sin. Ponder it on your beds and be silent. I like the King James version of ponder it on your bed is commune with your own heart. When you are disturbed, commune with your own heart. You know, Jesus said, when you pray, go into your room and close the door and pray to your Father who sees in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. I love that idea. The Desert Fathers in the early Christian tradition understood the room to which Jesus refers there as the room of the human heart. When you pray, go into your heart and commune with your Father. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. The beauty of that is that you can always do it. There is no circumstance in your life, there is no situation on earth that can ever occur in which we cannot, for a moment, even for just a second, step aside and go into that inner secret room of the heart, where we will find strength and we will find hope. Because the psalmist says to God in verse 7, you, God, have put gladness in my heart, more than when there grain and wine abound. Grain and wine were signs in the psalmist's day of the greatest abundance, the greatest provision in the material realm. If you had much grain and much wine, you were most to be envied because your life was filled with stuff. If you had grain and wine in abundance, you were the equivalent of Elon Musk and Bill Gates. Who's that other guy? The Amazon guy. Much wine and much grain was a sign of great material well-being. And you know what? The psalmist looks at all that and goes, so what? That's not what you need when you are in distress. Grain and wine will not help you when you are disturbed. What will help you is finding that deep, true, secret, inner place of the Spirit residing in your heart, where you will discover that God has put gladness in your heart. There's always a place of gladness that we can find. There's always a source of strength and wisdom and guidance deep within our spirit. But there's something, if we're going to find that, there's something we have to do. The psalmist says in verse 5, offer right sacrifices. To sacrifice something is to give something up. If we are going to enter the secret room of the heart and find that place of stillness, quiet, peace, and gladness in the midst of distress and disturbance, there's something we're going to have to give up. I don't know what it is for you. I expect it's more than just chocolate. It might be some activity that overstresses your life. It might be some relationship that is not a source of space and life for you. It might be some form of entertainment that is merely distracting anesthetic that keeps you dull and dense and unconscious. But there's something that we're going to have to give up, even just for a moment, in order to find that secret room, that place of gladness in the human heart. And that's why it's so powerful to me how the psalmist in the NRSV translation that I'm reading from starts out this psalm in the very first verse when he cries to God, "Answer me when I call, O God of my right." And then he says, "You gave me room when I was in distress." That's what we actually want when we're in distress. We think we want to get things under control. We think we want to exert our will over the forces of life and make everything run the way we think they ought to run. But we can't. And even if we did manage to control one teeny tiny little corner of our lives, before we know it, some other part of our lives would be out of control, and we would be back in distress and disturbance. What we really want, what our hearts really yearn for, in the midst of disturbance and distress, is room to be. We want to be able to breathe. We want to be able to open. We want to be able to come to that place in ourselves where we can follow the psalmist's advice and put your trust in the Lord. And then we will find the promise that he offers us at the end of this poem of distress, this tale of disturbance. We will find that we will, like the psalmist, be able to both lie down and sleep in peace. For you alone, O Lord, make me lie down in safety. that sleep that is refreshing and renewing, that sleep that is a sign of peace, that sleep that is true security and inner safety does not come from me exerting my will over anything. It doesn't come from my ability to be in control. It doesn't come from the big wall I build around my life. It doesn't come from the weapons or the money that I amass to keep myself feeling secure. It comes from making a right sacrifice, from giving up my need to be in control and trusting that there is a power and a light and a goodness and a beauty that dwells in my heart that is true and deep and abiding gladness. Amen.